They gave us the greatest Superman love story of the 90s, but the romance was a complete corporate fraud. Off camera, Teri Hatcher and Dean Cain couldn't stand the sight of each other. Their legendary chemistry was actually weaponized frustration. Trapped by ironclad ABC contracts, these two completely incompatible actors were forced into a 16-hour-a-day prison. Teri's relentless perfectionism collided violently with Dean's pragmatic efficiency. The result wasn't love, it was a silent, toxic war. Today we expose the fake Superman romance and how a multi-billion-dollar network forced two enemies to kiss for the cameras. But how did two working actors end up in this multi-million-dollar cage? It started in 1993. At the time, the ABC network was looking for a massive, reliable hit. Executives decided to take the classic Superman story and push it in a completely new direction. Instead of focusing heavily on special effects, fighting villains, and standard superhero action, they stripped the concept down to its core. They decided to make a romantic comedy. The entire premise of the new show was built on the dating phase between Lois Lane and Clark Kent. The witty, fast-paced banter between the two characters was designed to hook adult viewers, and it worked instantly. The show debuted to a massive audience, drawing in millions of viewers who were completely captivated by the romantic tension on their screens. The immediate, explosive success of the program created an instant commercial empire. The on-screen aura of Teri and Dean generated astronomical financial value for the network. Practically overnight, their faces were plastered across every entertainment magazine in the country. They were on children's lunchboxes, action figures, and massive promotional billboards. The viewing public, completely taken in by the clever scripts and the warm lighting, naturally assumed that this perfect on-screen dynamic came from a place of genuine friendship. In the scenes, they bought into the illusion completely, but the reality of working on a hit television show in the 1990s was far from romantic. It was an industrial high-pressure factory. When Teri Hatcher and Dean Cain signed their original contracts, they were two working actors looking for a steady paycheck. They did not realize they were signing away their physical and mental autonomy to a multi-billion-dollar corporation. In Hollywood, when a show becomes a massive financial success, the actors immediately lose their status as human beings. They become corporate assets. The network executives do not care if the actors are happy, tired, or comfortable. They only care that the product is delivered on time, so the advertising checks can clear. From the very first weeks of filming in 1993, the pressure of this corporate machine began to squeeze the two lead actors. They were forced to work exhausting, 14 to 16-hour days, 5 days a week. They were constantly in each other's physical space. In a healthy working environment, colleagues can step away, take a break, and decompress. But the script of Lois and Clark demanded that Teri and Dean be in almost every single scene together. They were financially and legally shackled to one another. This intense forced proximity is exactly what caused the initial cracks in their relationship. The hostility did not start with a massive, dramatic screaming match or a personal betrayal. The root cause of their mutual resentment was far more grounded and far more common in the workplace. It came down to a complete fundamental clash in how they viewed their jobs. Teri Hatcher approached the role of Lois Lane with an intense, demanding level of perfectionism. She had been working hard to secure a leading role that would define her career, and she took the responsibility incredibly seriously. She treated the television set like a high-end film production. Teri would frequently stop the productions, on to ask for another take if she felt her performance was not perfect. She would involve herself in the technical details, questioning the lighting setups, the camera angles, and the specific wording of the scripts to ensure her character looked and sounded flawless. She believed that this meticulous attention to detail was exactly what the audience deserved, and she was willing to halt the entire crew to get it right. Dean Cain operated on a completely different frequency. Before he was an actor, Dean was a highly disciplined athlete who had graduated from Princeton University. He brought a strict, pragmatic, sports-like mentality to the soundstage. For him, acting on a television schedule was about efficiency and execution. He viewed the production as a strict daily timetable. His method was simple: arrive at the studio on time, memorize the dialogue perfectly, hit his physical marks on the floor, shoot the scene as quickly as possible, and go home to live his actual life. He did not want to overthink the artistic motivation behind every single line. He just wanted to get the job done efficiently so the crew could wrap up for the day. Put these two radically different mindsets into a high-pressure, enclosed environment for 16 hours a day, and a silent, toxic friction is absolutely inevitable. As the first season progressed, Dean began to view Teri's perfectionism not as dedication, but as supreme arrogance. From his pragmatic perspective, her constant requests for new takes and lighting adjustments were incredibly selfish. He felt she was deliberately slowing down the entire production, keeping the tired crew on their feet for extra hours simply to satisfy her own ego. He looked at her and saw a difficult star who did not respect other people's time. Conversely, Teri looked at Dean's rapid-fire, efficient approach and felt a deep lack of artistic respect. She felt she was working alongside a man who was entirely superficial. To her, Dean was just reciting words off a page without digging into the emotional depth of the scene. She felt she was carrying the entire artistic weight of the show on her own shoulders, while her leading man simply wanted to punch his time card and leave. This massive difference in professional philosophy created a daily, grinding frustration. They were two people pulling a heavy cart in completely opposite directions. Because they were the two most important people on the set, their silent conflict began to dictate the entire mood of the production. The executives at ABC saw the early warning signs of this friction, but they chose to completely ignore it. The ratings were climbing, the merchandise was selling out, and the money was pouring in. The corporation made a calculated decision to turn a blind eye to the toxic environment forming on their soundstage, leaving their two lead actors to slowly, quietly tear each other apart in the shadows. As the production rolled into late 1993 and early 1994, the unspoken frustration between Teri Hatcher and Dean Cain hardened into a permanent freezing wall of silence. They realized they could not change each other's working methods. Teri was never going to lower her standards for perfection, and Dean was never going to abandon his strict desire for efficiency. Because they could not agree on how to work together, they chose the only coping mechanism left in a toxic environment: complete and utter isolation. They built an invisible ice wall right in the middle of the soundstage. Crew members who worked on the set during this period witnessed a bizarre daily psychological routine. When the director shouted "action," Teri and Dean would instantly snap into character. They would smile, deliver their witty banter, and act like two people slowly falling in love. But the exact second the director yelled "cut," the illusion shattered. There was no transition. There was no friendly chatter between takes to ease the tension. They would immediately turn their backs on each other and walk in completely opposite directions. They retreated to their private trailers and closed the doors. They absolutely refused to communicate unless the dialogue was written in the script. In a normal romantic production, actors spend hours running lines together to build emotional depth and trust. Teri and Dean entirely abandoned this process. They began to treat each other not as human beings or creative partners, but simply as moving props. This silent treatment was a defensive strategy. It was a way to protect their own egos from the daily exhaustion of working with someone they fundamentally despised. But by refusing to speak, they turned the television set into a hostile, frozen environment. The crew had to navigate this icy atmosphere every single day. The camera operators, the makeup artists, and the lighting technicians had to work in absolute silence, terrified of triggering a Cold War that could delay the shooting schedule. The soundstage was completely devoid of the warmth you would expect from a romantic comedy. It was a grim mechanical assembly line where love was strictly manufactured under freezing conditions. By 1994, Lois and Clark was a massive financial asset, competing with primetime blockbusters. Executives knew exactly how fraught the environment on their set had become, but instead of intervening, they locked the doors. Bound by ironclad network contracts, Teri and Dean were held to their roles under the severe threat of financial ruin. In the entertainment industry, attempting to quit a hit show means facing lawsuits, bankruptcy, and the destruction of future careers. Trapped by their own massive success, the actors were forced to swallow their genuine resentment. Every morning they put on the famous costumes, fully aware they were serving as highly paid assets to the ABC network's profit margins. The executives forced two people who could not stand the sight of each other to remain in close cow contact for 16 hours a day. The system demanded that they completely suppress their natural human reactions to protect the advertising revenue from major brands. The corporate machine successfully caged them, but the intense, unaddressed frustration between the two stars had to go somewhere. It could not just disappear. The producers soon realized they could not fix the mutual hatred, so they made a highly calculated, deeply cynical decision on the studio floor. If they could not make the actors like each other, they would simply weaponize their anger. When a multi-million-dollar television production is trapped with two lead actors who silently despise each other, the directors are faced with an impossible technical problem. By the second season in late 1994, the directors of Lois and Clark knew that Teri Hatcher and Dean Cain were completely incapable of generating warm, genuine affection for each other. The ice wall between them was absolute. But the Hollywood machine does not stop for human discomfort. If the corporation cannot manufacture genuine love, they will find a substitute. The production team recognized the distinct differences in their personalities and leaned into it. The natural tension between Teri's perfectionism and Dean's pragmatic approach mirrored the competitive banter between Lois and Clark. Their real-life friction inadvertently translated into authentic, crackling on-screen chemistry. When Teri Hatcher glared at Dean Cain, it was her raw, unadulterated anger at his refusal to take the artistic process seriously. When Dean looked back at her with a tight, clenched jaw, it was his genuine exhaustion with her relentless perfectionism. The directors would intentionally let the cameras roll while the two actors were silently fuming at each other over a missed mark or a lighting delay. They captured the rigid body language, the sharp tones of voice, and the absolute lack of patience they held for one another. Then, the editor In the post-production rooms took that footage, added a romantic, sweeping musical score, and broadcast it to millions of people. This is the ultimate terrifying psychological manipulation of the television industry. The executives took the genuine misery and anger of their employees and successfully repackaged it as premium romantic entertainment. The viewing public, completely unaware of the Cold War happening in the studio, misinterpreted this raw hostility as massive sexual tension. The audience believed they were watching the sparks of two people desperately trying to fight their mutual attraction. In reality, they were watching two corporate hostages desperately trying to survive a 16-hour shift with a coworker they could not stand. The network was literally monetizing their daily misery. As 1995 arrived, this weaponized tension pushed the ratings even higher, but it also fundamentally destabilized the power dynamic on the set. A massive shift occurred outside the studio walls that would turn the silent resentment into an active battle for screen supremacy. The internet was beginning to take hold in American culture, and Teri Hatcher did a promotional photo shoot wrapped entirely in the red Superman cape. That single image exploded. It became the most downloaded photograph on the early internet. Almost overnight, Teri transitioned from a successful television actress into a massive international sex symbol. This cultural explosion completely shifted the financial balance of the show. Teri Hatcher became the undisputed primary draw. The media wanted to interview her. The magazines wanted her on their covers. And her salary negotiations gave her massive leverage over the ABC network. She was no longer just the female lead. She was the entire marketing engine of the franchise. For Dean Cain, this shift was deeply humiliating. He was cast to play Superman, the ultimate American hero and the most famous fictional character on the planet. Yet, on his own television show, he was rapidly being reduced to a supporting player. He was an incredibly competitive former athlete, and the Hollywood system was actively pushing him into second place. The media coverage frequently treated him as just the handsome guy standing next to the real star of the show. This deep professional jealousy violently collided with their already toxic personal relationship. The silent ice wall on the soundstage cracked, and a bitter, calculated war for control broke out. Because they still refused to speak to each other directly, they fought their battles through the scripts and the directors. It became a ruthless daily negotiation of ego. If Teri felt a scene was focusing too much on Dean, she would use her massive star power to demand script rewrites, ensuring Lois Lane had the final, most impactful line of dialogue. Dean, feeling deeply undermined, would counter by intentionally rushing his delivery or refusing to give her the physical reaction she needed for her close-up shots. They began actively sabotaging each other's performances to protect their own screen time. They were counting words in the script, fighting over the lighting setups, and demanding that the cameras favor their specific angles. The soundstage of Lois and Clark completely ceased to be a creative environment. It became a highly political, deeply aggressive corporate battlefield. The two stars were locked in a constant, exhausting struggle to assert dominance over the billion-dollar property. The ABC network executives simply watched the war from a safe distance, completely refusing to intervene as long as the episodes were delivered on time. They allowed the working conditions to deteriorate into absolute madness, setting the stage for the most psychologically damaging phase of the entire production. The characters in the script were finally scheduled to fall in love, meaning Teri and Dean could no longer just argue on camera. They were about to be forced into coldest physical intimacy in the history of television. As the television series moved past its middle seasons, the ABC network executives faced a massive, unavoidable narrative problem. The entire premise of the show was built on the eventual romantic union of the two main characters. They had successfully dragged out the rivalry and the witty arguments for as long as possible, weaponizing the real-life hostility between their lead actors to create great television. But the audience was growing impatient. The script dictated that Lois Lane and Clark Kent finally had to cross the line. They had to fall deeply, passionately in love. This corporate narrative requirement forced Teri Hatcher and Dean Cain into the most psychologically damaging phase of the entire production. They could no longer just stand across a desk and yell at each other. The new scripts demanded intense physical intimacy. They were required to hold each other, stroke each other's faces, gaze deeply into each other's eyes, and perform long, passionate kisses. For two people who had spent years building a massive, freezing wall of mutual resentment, this was an absolute nightmare. In any standard workplace, forcing two colleagues who actively despise each other to engage in physical contact would be a massive human resources violation. It would be considered a completely hostile working environment. But the Hollywood system does not recognize standard workplace boundaries. The television contract completely overrides personal comfort. Teri and Dean were legally obligated to perform these acts of intimacy, or they would face immediate financial ruin and the total destruction of their careers. They had to swallow their pride, their anger, and their sheer physical reluctance to protect their paychecks. The reality of filming those romantic scenes was incredibly bleak. The warmth and passion that millions of viewers saw on their television screens was a complete, calculated, mechanical illusion. When the Cible Sehaoui director called for a kissing scene, there was absolutely no emotional connection. Teri and Dean treated the intimacy exactly like a highly dangerous stunt sequence. They choreographed every single physical movement with cold, mathematical precision. They agreed on exactly where their hands would go, how long the kiss would last, and the precise moment they would pull away. There was no spontaneity, no lingering affection, and absolutely no comfort. It was a purely transactional physical interaction. The exact second the director shouted, "Cut!" the romantic illusion violently collapsed. Crew members from the set noted that the two actors would immediately push away from each other the moment the camera stopped rolling. They would wipe their mouths, physically step back to reestablish their strict personal boundaries, and walk away in complete silence. They did not speak, they did not laugh off the awkwardness, and they did not look back. This requirement to constantly violate their own physical boundaries took a massive psychological toll. It is a severe form of mental exhaustion to force your brain to project intense love toward a person your body actively rejects. Every single romantic scene was a grueling endurance test. Teri had to suppress her total frustration with Dean's working methods, look into his eyes, and pretend he was the love of her life. Dean had to suppress his deep resentment of her massive star power, wrap his arms around her, and project total devotion. The corporate machine essentially forced them to weaponize their own bodies against their own minds, simply to satisfy the syndication demands and keep the merchandise flying off the shelves. While the soundstage had devolved into a freezing, miserable environment, the ABC network was actively running a massive, highly funded deception campaign in the outside world. The executives knew exactly how bad the situation was on the studio floor. They knew that their two lead actors were entirely incapable of holding a normal conversation without a camera pointed at them. But they also knew that their billion-dollar advertising revenue relied entirely on the public believing in the magic of the Superman romance. To protect their financial asset, the network unleashed the full, terrifying power of the Hollywood public relations machine. They launched an aggressive brainwashing campaign directed at the viewing public. The strategy was to flood the media with so many images of Teri and Dean looking happy together that nobody would ever suspect the Cold War happening behind the scenes. The network booked them on endless promotional tours, late-night talk shows, and high-profile magazine photo shoots. This forced Teri and Dean to take their toxic dynamic on the road. When they appeared on the cover of magazines like TV Guide, the images showed them holding each other tightly, smiling brightly, looking like the perfect Hollywood couple. The public had absolutely no idea that just out of frame, network publicists and highly paid managers were standing guard, strictly enforcing a temporary truce just long enough for the photographer to capture the shot. The psychological dissonance of this public relations campaign was staggering. Teri and Dean were forced to lie to the entire world on a daily basis. During the interviews, journalists would constantly ask them about their amazing chemistry. They had to smile, laugh, and invent fake, charming stories about how much they enjoyed working together. They had to sit shoulder to shoulder on television sofas, pretending to be great friends, while secretly counting the seconds until the interview was over so they could escape to separate cars. The ABC network effectively forced their actors to participate in a massive corporate fraud. They deliberately manipulated the emotions of millions of viewers. The audience was buying the magazines, buying the action figures, and tuning in every single week because they believed in the authenticity of the romance. They were completely unaware that they were being systematically lied to by a corporation that only cared about maintaining its profit margins. Back on the studio lot, the massive stress of maintaining this global lie began to completely crush the entire crew. The production environment became an absolute minefield. Every single person working on the show, from the lighting technicians to the wardrobe department, had to operate in a state of constant, high-alert anxiety. They knew that the two stars were entirely exhausted, deeply resentful, and pushed to their absolute psychological limits. The crew had to work with extreme caution to ensure they did not accidentally trigger an explosion. If a camera broke or a lighting rig failed, it meant Teri and Dean had to stand next to each other in the freezing silence for even longer. The entire technical production was streamlined for the sole purpose of keeping the two lead actors apart as much as humanly possible. The classic story of Superman had been entirely corrupted. It was no longer a show about a superhero saving the world. It was a daily, grueling exercise in corporate damage control, designed entirely to keep two hostile employees from completely destroying a billion-dollar investment. But the television machine is incredibly greedy. It never knows when to stop. The executives at ABC looked at the massive ratings generated by the dating storyline and decided they needed to push the property to its absolute final limit. They were preparing to force Teri Hatcher and Dean Cain into the ultimate inescapable television trap. They were going to make them get married. As the production dragged heavily into 1996, the executives at the ABC network hit a massive, unavoidable structural wall. The entire television series had been built on a very specific, highly lucrative formula: the chase. The audience tuned in every week to watch the slow, tense romantic build-up between Lois Lane and Clark Key. But in the television industry, the romantic comedy format contains a fatal flaw. Once the two main characters finally get together, the central tension completely evaporates. The writers had completely run out of ways to keep them apart without insulting the intelligence of their viewers. The corporate machine had to face the reality that a wedding was absolutely necessary to keep the story moving forward. But this was not going to be a normal television wedding. The ABC network did not just own a standard television show, they were leasing the most famous superhero property on the planet. This meant they had to coordinate their storytelling with another massive corporate entity, DC Comics. In a boardroom deal that perfectly illustrates how Hollywood treats art as a pure manufactured product, the network executives and the comic book publishers agreed to a massive, highly synchronized multimedia event. They decided that the television characters and the comic book characters would get married at the exact same time in the autumn of 1996. This corporate synergy transformed a simple television episode into a global marketing juggernaut. It was no longer just a storyline, it was a multi-million-dollar product launch. DC Comics was preparing to sell millions of special edition comic books, and ABC was preparing to sell premium advertising space at Super Bowl rates. The entire weight of this massive cross-platform financial operation fell squarely onto the shoulders of the two people who were entirely incapable of standing each other's presence. The pressure on Teri Hatcher and Dean Cain increased exponentially. They were no longer just acting in a popular show. They were the physical anchors of a historic pop culture milestone. The network executives, terrified of losing the audience's interest before the big event, forced the writers to stall. This resulted in some of the most absurd, humiliating storylines in the history of the franchise. To delay the wedding until the corporate mandated date in October, the writers introduced ridiculous plots involving amnesia, fake weddings, and even a clone of Lois Lane who ate frogs. For the actors, this was a profound artistic degradation. Teri Hatcher, who approached her work with intense perfectionism, was forced to stand on set and deliver incredibly stupid, illogical dialogue. She felt her character was being completely destroyed simply to satisfy a corporate timeline. Dean Cain, who just wanted to get the work done efficiently, was forced to act out bizarre, frustrating scenarios that made absolutely no narrative sense. The terrible quality of the scripts poured pure gasoline on their existing mutual hatred. They were both trapped in a sinking ship, being forced to play the violin, while the corporate executives counted the money on the upper deck. When the actual time came to film the highly anticipated wedding episode, early in the 4th season, the soundstage was a grim, miserable place. The set designers had built a beautiful romantic chapel. The lighting technicians spent hours crafting the perfect warm glow. The wardrobe department fitted Teri in an exquisite, highly publicized wedding dress and put Dean in a sharp tuxedo. Visually, it was a masterpiece of romantic television. Psychologically, it was a completely hollow, highly traumatizing execution of a contract. Filming a television wedding takes days of grueling, repetitive work. Teri and Dean were forced to stand at the altar surrounded by the supporting cast and run through the exact same motions for hours on end. They had to hold hands, look deeply into each other's eyes, and deliver historic vows of eternal love. The audience at home, when the episode finally aired, heard Lois and Clark promising to cherish each other forever. But the reality on the studio floor was completely devoid of human warmth. When you watch the footage of that wedding carefully, knowing the truth of the working environment, the performance completely changes. You can see the heavy, unspoken exhaustion behind their eyes. They are not looking at a beloved partner. They are staring at a brick wall. The smiles are incredibly tight. The physical touches are highly calculated and completely rigid. They are two corporate employees performing a highly uncomfortable mechanical task just to secure their release at the end of the day. The director would yell, "Cut," and the bride and groom would instantly drop their hands and walk away from the altar in complete silence. There was no celebration on the set. There were no congratulations. The crew simply reset the cameras and prepared to film the fake love story from another angle. The ABC network had successfully forced two bitter enemies to enact the ultimate symbol of romantic devotion. They had packaged a deeply toxic workplace dynamic in white lace and sold it to millions of people as a fairy tale. But the executives made a fatal miscalculation. They believed their own public relations machine. They assumed that the sheer spectacle of the wedding would secure the show's ratings for years to come. They failed to understand a fundamental rule of television. An audience will forgive a lot of things, but they will never forgive being bored. The exact second Lois and Clark said, "I do," the primary engine of the series completely died. The weaponized tension that the directors had relied on for 3 years was instantly gone. The characters were now a happily married couple, which meant Teri and Dean had to pretend to be comfortable, domestic, and at peace with each other. This was a completely impossible task. They could fake anger and they could fake dramatic passion, but they could absolutely not fake comfortable, quiet intimacy. The ice wall between them was far too thick without the sharp arguments and the romantic chase to hide behind. The absolute lack of genuine chemistry became glaringly obvious to the viewing public. The audience tuned in the W, eek after the wedding, expecting to see a deeply connected couple navigating their new life. Instead, they saw two actors who looked completely dead inside. The dialogue felt flat. The interactions felt entirely forced. The magical illusion that had sustained the billion-dollar property for 3 years completely shattered, and the network was about to face a catastrophic, rapid collapse. The immediate aftermath of the television wedding in the autumn of 1996 triggered a rapid, catastrophic collapse of the entire franchise. The executives at the ABC network had completely misunderstood the fundamental mechanics of their own success. They had relied entirely on the massive, aggressive marketing campaign surrounding the wedding to secure their financial future. They assumed that once Lois and Clark were married, the audience would simply stick around out of loyalty to the characters. They were completely wrong. When a television show is built entirely on the romantic chase, the actual marriage is not a new beginning. It is a narrative dead end. For 3 years, the directors had successfully hidden the intense, real-life hatred between Teri Hatcher and Dean Cain by weaponizing their frustration. The arguments, the tension, and the sharp glares were perfectly disguised as two stubborn people fighting their mutual attraction. But the exact second the character said, "I do," that specific narrative shield was permanently removed. The scripts for the 4th season required Lois and Clark to behave like a happily married, deeply settled couple. They were supposed to share quiet mornings in their apartment, drink coffee together, and look at each other with a soft, comfortable, domestic peace. This was the one thing Teri and Dean were completely, fundamentally incapable of faking. You can act out anger. You can act out sudden, dramatic passion. But you cannot fake the subtle, quiet comfort of sitting in a room with a person you genuinely trust. When the cameras roll, all led on these domestic scenes, the atmosphere on the soundstage became painfully awkward. The ice wall between the two actors was thicker than ever. They were exhausted, frustrated, and completely drained by the daily requirement to suppress their true feelings. Without the fast-paced arguments to hide behind, the absolute lack of genuine human connection became glaringly obvious. When Teri looked at Dean across a fake kitchen table, the audience did not see a loving wife. They saw a tired actress staring at a coworker she wanted to avoid. When Dean smiled back, it was a tight, mechanical grimace. The space between them on the screen was completely dead. The viewing public is incredibly perceptive. They might not have known the specific details of the backstage Cold War, but they instantly felt the massive drop in energy. The magic was entirely gone. The show felt flat, boring, and emotionally hollow. Millions of viewers who had invested years of their lives into following this romance simply tuned out. The television ratings, which had once rivaled the biggest events on network broadcasting, began to drop like a stone in freefall. In the executive boardrooms at ABC, the initial confidence quickly turned into sheer corporate panic. The network was suddenly bleeding viewers, which meant they were losing millions of dollars in advertising revenue every single week. The executives desperately tried to force the writers to inject new excitement into the show. They demanded new villains, bigger special effects, and increasingly bizarre storylines to distract the audience from the complete lack of romantic chemistry. But the core engine of the property was completely broken. You cannot sell a romantic comedy when the two leads look like they would rather be anywhere else on the planet. This final season became a grueling psychological death march for Teri and Dean. They were trapped on a sinking ship, fully aware that the show was failing, but legally bound by their Connie. Tracks to keep filming every single day. The environment on the set shifted from a hostile Cold War into a heavy, depressing state of apathy. The daily battles for screen supremacy and script control completely stopped. There was no point in fighting over the best lighting angle when nobody was watching the show anymore. They simply showed up, punched their time cards, recited the terrible dialogue, and waited for the inevitable end. The multi-billion-dollar machine that had controlled their lives, dictated their physical boundaries, and profited off their misery was finally grinding to a halt. In the spring of 1997, the ABC network made a cold, strictly financial decision. The ratings had dropped below the profitable threshold. The executives did not call a meeting to thank the actors for their years of hard work. They did not plan a massive, respectful farewell episode to give the loyal fans a sense of closure. They simply looked at the spreadsheet, saw the negative numbers, and ruthlessly pulled the plug. Lois and Clark was officially canceled. The way the series ended perfectly illustrates the unfeeling industrial nature of the Hollywood system. The final episode that aired was not written to be a series finale. It ended on a strange, unresolved cliffhanger involving a mysterious baby. The network simply stopped paying for the production, leaving the story completely unfinished. To the millions of fans who still cared, it was a massive betrayal. But to Teri Hatcher and Dean Cain, it was the greatest gift the network could have possibly given them. It was a prison release. There were no tears on the final day of filming. There was no grand wrap party where the two stars hugged and reminisced about their incredible journey together. The exact second the final scene was completed, the heavy corporate handcuffs unlocked. Teri and Dean retreated to their respective trailers, packed their belongings, and walked off the studio lot. They did not look back. T. Hay walked in opposite directions, finally free from the invisible ice wall, free from the forced physical intimacy, and free from the daily requirement to pretend they did not despise each other. The fake Superman romance was officially dead. When we look back at the cultural impact of Lois and Clark, it strips away the glamorous illusions of television production. The audience in the 1990s believed they were witnessing the greatest love story of their generation. In reality, they were watching two dedicated professionals pushing through grueling schedules and personal differences to deliver a legendary performance. Teri Hatcher and Dean Cain survived the intense pressure of the network machine, both going on to have highly successful careers. Their time together remains a testament to the fact that on-screen magic does not always require off-screen friendship. It simply requires two actors disciplined enough to put the story first, proving that the most compelling dramas are often fueled by the hidden realities behind the studio gates.